Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Vincast. My name is James Guestbrook, sometimes known as the Intrepid Wino, and very excitingly, we actually have some international listeners to the podcast now. I've had a few people hit me up on Twitter in the last couple of days, saying that they've heard a recent episode or they want to know ways they could listen to it. So it's really fantastic. They were actually from the US, and if you are international or wherever you are, just let me know. I'd love to hear from you. Just, if you're enjoying the show or if you have any questions, just hit me up. Obviously, you can listen to the show on my website, intrepidwino.com. That's generally the first place that it goes up. But then the show actually gets picked up via the feed that I provide to iTunes and Stitcher. And essentially, if you have an iPhone or an iPad, you can subscribe to the podcast with the podcasting app. And that way, either you can download it on iTunes and transfer it, or you can download it straight to your device. And that actually you can keep the episode and listen to them as many times or as often, and you can stop and start and however you want. And Stitcher is essentially the same, but Stitcher actually works on Android as well. And so, the benefit of listening on the through iTunes podcasting app or Stitcher is you can actually interact. You can make comments. You can leave ratings. You can share them. They all connect in with stuff like Twitter and Facebook. So, would really appreciate if you enjoy the show. Please do share it with more people to get them really into wine, because ultimately that's what I'm trying to do, is just get the message out about wine and bring people in who may be interested or maybe want to know more, to find out a little bit more. But thanks as always, guys, for listening and always for your support. So today I've actually got someone on the show who I've known for a little while now. I met him through Wine Communicators of Australia, and I thought has a really interesting perspective, particularly in terms of Australian wine, because he's actually, apart from someone from a winery, is my first international guest, or second international guest, I guess. And his name is Ed Merrison, and he is a freelance journalist. So he writes about, amongst other things, wine and travel and business, and lives down, in fact, on my favourite wine region in Australia, the Mornington Peninsula. So thought I'd invite him in for a chat. So thank you for joining us today, Ed.
Good morning, James. Thanks for having me.
So, Ed, I tend to ask my guests, what was the first interaction with wine that got you interested?
My first interaction with wine growing up really was probably Christmases with an uncle or two uncles of mine who were big wine drinkers. One of them always had pretty wealthy clients. He was in property in the UK, sort of rural property, and a lot of his clients used to give him very good wines, and he used to keep a fantastic cellar in a proper old house, proper mouldy old cellar that he used to stomp down the brick steps and go and search down. And every now and again, when we were probably far more likely to be drinking beer, but also too young to be drinking officially, Christmas time, obviously all bets are off and you're allowed to do things you're not supposed to, and we would all
you're around family.
Yeah, of course. No, it's just we never went out of control. But I do remember very well being invited to go down into the cellar every now and again and choose something, and it would be something I knew nothing about, but obviously you look at things, look at labels, pictures, names, and I was always into languages. I learnt French from quite a young age, and then ended up studying them at university. And probably a lot of my background in wine comes down to certainly travel and also languages. So although it was not relevant at all to the liquid in the bottle, just looking at names from exotic places in south of France or Italy or Spain, those things that I came across in that cellar just always got me dreaming of places I wanted to go and visit. And I'm sure I plonked a few pretty ordinary drops on the table, but it was quite fun to be invited down to that cellar. that was probably my first interaction.
Was it a fun game to sort of, pronouncing the full names and all of the different regions and vineyards and that sort of thing?
Yeah, it's something I've probably never grown out of, actually, to be honest. Part of my fascination with Italian wine these days is just how wonderful all the grapes sound in Italy and all the regions.
Yeah.
They just always sort of conjure up an idea when you look at, Montepulciano d'Abruzzo or something like that. I just can't help but go and look at an atlas and go and look at where these things are grown and what the weather's like and what the climate's like, what the cuisine is like. And if I haven't been to them, I think about how much I'd like to go there.
And what was the path that kind of led you towards, I guess, journalism and then wanting to write about the things that I guess you now write about?
Well, really going back to what I said before, my background was languages. I studied. I was quite fortunate, really, to study French very young at school. It was one of those random things. Our primary school just happened to have a French teacher called Madame Heather, who was. We had a little caravan, and we used to go out, a group of 5 of us, and do these French lessons. And that was really something that stayed with me throughout school. I was really interested in it because we did French early, because I was quite good at it. Ended up doing Spanish as an extra subject after that. German, Russian, various things. And everything I learned in languages just what made me want to travel, read books, watch films from other places and go.
Well, certainly as a student of languages myself, at least in the past, that was kind of one of the fundamental parts of learning the language was you learn about the culture, you maybe learn about geography, that kind of thing, because it's only served to strengthen your connection with the language.
Yep.
To put it in context.
Yep, absolutely. And I guess the reason for using it practically is to go and talk to people who have different experiences from you, who grew up in a different place and who look at the world in a different way. And that's kind of the next level, I guess, when you go to those places, or when you're at home and you're lucky enough to have people coming through who come from somewhere else.
Did you have the opportunity to go over to continental Europe early
Yeah,
on?
I did. Well, I grew up in Kent, in the south of England, so we were, about an hour away from the ferry across to France. So it's quite usual for primary school age kids growing up, certainly in the south of England, just to hop on a ferry with a school group. That's just at primary school and go over.
In Australia, when we think ferry, we think, Sydney Harbour.
Yeah.
To catch a ferry to a different country is just sort of so to us.
So I was 10 when I went on my first school trip to France.
Yeah.
In those days, it wasn't all about Burgundy and Bordeaux. It was about firecrackers and Hollywood chewing gum. That was the big the big draw card. Hollywood chewing gum. So the French kids were mad into their chewing gum, and it was nothing good about it. I hate chewing gum anyway, but it was kind of a novelty at the time.
Just something you can get.
And firecrackers were kind of banned in England at the time. And
I wouldn't know anything about that.
French kids were right into them. So that was so. Ever since then, really went overseas quite a lot.
How can you have bonfire night without firecrackers?
Your fireworks were more easy to get hold of, but these were these little things that you could kind of just
bang.
Yeah, the bangers, I guess.
Sure.
Which is confusing, of course, because they're sausages as well, where I come from. But from there, though, I travelled as well to Spain for the first time on a school exchange, probably around the age of 16.
Yep.
And that was great fun. Obviously, we went and at that age, you are drinking beer and offered wine by families that you go and stay with, and you don't really say no to anything. I don't think when you do that,
it'd be rude.
It would be rude to, exactly. So I was very fortunate enough to go on those sort of school exchanges to various places, and obviously you discover food, you discover wine, but you talk to people as well, and that's really what travel and wine have often been about to me. And it sort of completes the circle, really, in that wine speaks itself so much of where it's grown and the culture it grew up in, and there are so many reasons for doing things the way people do that are just bound to the land and the climate where they're grown.
And so going there and I guess interacting with the people and eating the food and drinking the wine, it all kind of just essentially strengthen the connection to it and kind of, and also I guess instilled this love and interest in you.
Yeah, absolutely. And it also keeps the conversation going, I think. The more questions you ask about wine, the more it sparks your curiosity. I mean, it's never anything other than, I think, than an organic expression of where it comes from, and the people who make it respond very much, as I said, to their own environment and their own history and their own traditions, and that's really why it's an ongoing story.
I always think that there's almost maybe 2 or 3 kind of epiphany moments in any wine lover's experience. The first one is where you actually discover the love of wine, I think, whether it's tasting a specific wine or having wine in a certain context, or at that time it was perfect, or just something that made you kind of go, oh my God, wine is amazing. You realize the beauty and the fact that it's always different, that kind of thing. And then I think the second epiphany moment is where you've learned enough to then realize that you can never know everything, and that sets you on that kind of path, I guess. It can either totally demoralize you to know you can never know everything. It's totally impossible, or you can actually say, oh, that's great. That means that I'm no different to anyone else, because no one can know everything. So yeah, and then you're just on that quest to kind of find out as much as you can whilst you still can.
Yeah.
Did you sort of have that kind of experience? Like when, yeah.
Well, I suppose so stage one for me was the sort of European experience.
Yeah.
And I have to say, I moved to Australia in 2002. So for many Australians who are in the wine industry, I well and truly squandered that experience of being in Europe, because I wasn't a wine drinker. I didn't come from a wine background. My father's been teetotal since 1985, which kind of closed off that option at home.
Yeah.
Hence the importance of the uncle's influence and that cellar. So that was the first, I guess the first stage though was, in fact, going back to what you said, that sort of discovery about what's interesting about it. Going back to that cellar, there was one day I was asked to go down and get 2 different white wines to start a meal. And one of them was Sancerre and one of them was Pouilly-Fuissé. I think I'd probably heard of Sancerre at the time. I certainly hadn't heard of Pouilly-Fuissé. So I had to, ask how it was spelt. I'm not convinced my uncle probably would have pronounced it that well anyway. Mm-hmm. But I remember coming back with these 2 white wines, and I was of that, I suppose, that ignorant background at that point, that I didn't know what either of these things were. Mm-hmm. And probably didn't think that they were that different from one another. They had very different names. That's all I knew. And came back and tried them both. And obviously wildly different wines. And that was my first sort of moment, definitely, where I'd say, wow, there is a lot to this. These are poles apart, and I couldn't put my finger on why they were different, but they were massively different. Mm-hmm. And I thought that in itself was quite cool. And then from there, the European phase, I guess, was travelling. As I said, I lived in Granada as well, in the south of Spain, for a year, and we drank wine pretty indiscriminately at the time, but obviously developed more of an interest. But it really ticked up a notch when I came to Australia.
That's interesting.
Yeah, I would say that I'm probably not alone in this, though. As I say, a lot of Aussies would say I squandered the opportunity of being in Europe. I came over here when I was about 25 years old. Mm-hmm. So up to that point, I hadn't really delved into wine.
You maybe had plenty of drinking experience, but not.
Well, I was a beer background, very much. I was in Kent. We had breweries. I think our oldest brewery dates back to 1646, where I came from. So pretty serious heritage down there. Mm-hmm. And also, when you go to the pubs, you have always the local beers, but guest beers on tap. And when you when you grow up in, as I did, firstly Sussex and Kent, and you have pubs with your local beers. So we had Harvey's of Sussex, which remains one of my favourite beers. And in Kent, Shepherd Neame, around where I was, is the brewery. That's the one that dates back to something like 1646. But the guest beers from places like Wiltshire or Yorkshire, Cornwall. They're places that you don't necessarily go to, even though they're 3 hours away, 4 hours in a car. They feel like travelling when you're at that age. I think you're just drinking these pints, and they're all slightly different. And I love beer, so that was my background, and I suppose that was another reason why, even at the age of 25, I wasn't really a wine person. Coming here, though,
having said that, like if you're going to come here, you would have fit right in having a strong beer culture.
Wow, yeah. In those days, there was not a lot of...
Yeah, I think it's a different environment these days.
Well, there was a lot of what they called beer, and there was a lot of what I called beer. But yeah, I think it must be the same for a lot of English people coming over here, that you come and the accessibility of a lot of Australian wines, and I think, varietal labelling and other things, it's very easy to understand for me how that sort of simplifying of things...
Well, essentially, that's how Australia had so much success, particularly in the UK market. And it's funny because you talk about that kind of initial introduction to wine through your uncle and kind of looking at these European, mostly, I would assume, French labels and having the connection to the French place names, essentially.
Yeah. But they were mystifying then, though, as well. And that didn't bother me. I could see how that's a huge barrier for some people to learning about something.
Yeah, and
it didn't help me learn. All it did was fire my curiosity because I liked the names.
In a way, it's obviously it's different for us because generally we start from a varietal point of view. So we learn the varieties first, and then kind of learn, okay, this region uses that variety, or those varieties, that kind of thing, and it kind of maybe puts it in context. It must be a little bit more difficult to work back from that and actually find out, okay, white Burgundy is made from Chardonnay, but so's Puy-Fusé, or, it's sort of, okay. Because I thought they were different, but they're kind of the same. It's like, well, yes and no.
Yeah, but that's as you say, that's why I think varietal labelling was one of the great reasons that people found Australian wine so approachable, because you can draw the dots so much more easily.
Yeah.
And that's really what I did. I suppose I didn't really see that much overseas wine on the table when I was first here. It was a lot of Australian wine, and because I didn't come from here, that to me was already kind of exotic in itself.
I think even in 2002, almost all the wine imported, certainly from Europe, would have been at generally the higher end.
Yeah.
It has changed a lot, kind of since, weirdly enough, the global financial crisis. Partly because I think there are a lot of European wineries who were willing to relax their pricing somewhat, and maybe quality improved a lot in some of the more marginal regions. But most, I think it was the Australian dollar was so good that it made importing wines a little bit cheaper, and so therefore the price was a bit more accessible for a lot of consumers.
I think that's very true. I mean, I notice a lot more of it now, but then again, I'm of course in a stage
12
where,
years ago.
like most of my friends, having to spend more than I can afford on wine because I need to discover more and drink more good stuff. But there's a lot more of it around, I guess, imported certainly from a lot of different places, so it's an easy place to go discovering wines from Europe. But as I say, it's kind of odd way around to do it, to come over to Australia and do that.
But when you moved to Australia, where did you move?
To Melbourne.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because to a certain extent, Melbourne and Sydney, and I suppose most of the capitals probably do have more of a wine culture, shall we say, and certainly more dynamic wine markets than most of the rest of the country. So I think it's kind of slightly complicated to say in Australia, because Melbourne doesn't necessarily represent Australia. So Melbourne, is absolutely, you would get access to a lot of really good, certainly back then, a lot of good Australian wine. And so that was kind of the introduction, I guess, to Australian wine, was moving to Melbourne. You hadn't really drunk much Australian wine over in the UK?
Not really, no. It was there, but when I left the UK, and obviously as a student, the stuff that we were looking at was contained in one small part of a supermarket shelf, and that was a very cheap level of stuff.
Spanish and Italian wine.
And some of
South of France.
and the cheaper Australian
Yeah, fair
wine
enough.
then. But you know what I mean. It's when you're at that stage, you're not really going to spend more than a certain amount of money on wine. You don't even bother letting your eye wander across the shelf all that much.
I'm assuming yes, no. Wine obviously wasn't why you moved to Australia.
It wasn't. No, I'm married to an Australian, so I'm married to someone from here. We met in London in 1998.
You met an Australian in London?
Yeah,
that's weird.
That's right. And so she dragged me back here in 2002, and that was, as I say, when the sort of second stage of my interest in wine took place, because we went travelling, as you do, to various places. Margaret River was actually the first place, apart from the Mornington Peninsula, that I went to.
Not a bad start.
Not a bad start. And talking about accessibility, I mean, just that fact. I mean, I was like everyone else, I guess, that I think people forget who work in wine how intimidating it is, or how stupid you feel if you don't know how stupid your questions are. And it was easier, definitely, coming to Australia and asking questions and having conversations, because I found people were very open and chatty, and in that relaxed environment you feel like you can, let your guard down and come across as dumb and no one looks down at you, because...
Yeah, I think there are still people who unfortunately do intimidate people.
Yeah.
Whether that's their intention or not.
That's true, but I think cellar door wise...
Yeah, exactly.
You'd be doing a pretty bad job if you had people in your cellar door who are scaring people off. I know it happens, because I work in a cellar door and I hear stories, of course, about people's off experiences. But on the whole, certainly going to South Australia for the first time, my wife and I were commissioned to do a story for a backpacker magazine in London about wine touring. So
as a backpacker,
we pitched the idea because we wanted to go there, which is pretty much the basis of all the travel writing I've done, to go to Coonawarra, Clare, Barossa and McLaren Vale in 10 days or 12 days, I think we had. Took a couple of bicycles and a van, and had an absolute ball. And South Australia, I have to say, blew me away when I first went there, just for how friendly it was, how completely relaxed we were in other people's backyards, and how welcome we were. And we had so much fun. We just didn't stop just talking and laughing and learning about what these people did for a living and how it all worked, and learned so much about wine in that 12 days. Having done a lot of, research, and by that stage a fair amount of drinking. I mean, that was why I was able to pitch the story in the first time. I wasn't coming, with a completely blank background to it. But I was astonished at how much you could learn having done your homework. That's obviously the case now. As you say, the more you learn, the more you know that you don't know. But it was quite astonishing to me, and it was such good fun.
I think one of the big things that distinguishes, well, I suppose the New World in general, but certainly in Australia, is there's sort of no baggage. There's no kind of centuries of tradition and maybe expectation, and there's a lot less sort of rules and regulations stating exactly what you can grow and how you can make the wine, that kind of thing. And so I think that kind of, the Australian, I guess, mentality is pretty relaxed, but I think that's part of why that people are so kind of friendly and open and kind of, oh yeah, okay,
Yeah, I think
no worries.
I think it's also about personality. I think people forget, or perhaps Australia has changed, and that's why people don't realise that still on a relative scale this is the case, that Australians are, on the whole, very, very welcoming people, and they're very good talkers, and they often show a great deal of personality very early on in their interactions with people.
Yeah.
I mean, coming from the UK, which isn't as bad as some people would make out, but it's still pretty bad. It's terrible on a customer service basis, I think, compared to somewhere like Australia.
I have a theory.
Which is?
The colder the weather, the colder the people.
Yeah, it's possible. It's possible.
Get into the south of Spain or southern Italy, and people are just so naturally, open and friendly and hospitable. They're so generous they don't even realize they're being so generous. They don't even think about it. It's just the way they are. It's interesting. I suppose it's funny that Australians who, to a large extent, originate from Europe and a large proportion of that from the UK, have kind of adapted to the climate of Australia to a large extent. I think maybe Melbourne being a little bit cooler, possibly that has contributed to Melburnians being a little bit more. But even in Melbourne, people are pretty relaxed and open and generous.
Yeah, I think a lot of it is also perhaps a lack of rigidity in social etiquette, and in the UK, it's always been quite obvious.
What's going on about class?
But I think in the UK we always have this thing of what is the done thing and what isn't, and how you should behave. And sometimes, actually, I think that's not a bad thing. But sometimes it throws up very unnecessary barriers to acting in a normal, open, uninhibited way.
Yeah.
And Australians are certainly less inhibited. And sometimes that can be their downfall, perhaps some would say, in a social context.
Yeah.
But on the whole, look, it's much better to be open and warm and say what you think, rather than having sort of a couple of, layers of barriers to get through before people get to know you. And certainly going to those wine regions, you didn't get any sense that there was this sort of wall between you, or that you had to respect everything so much, and that this was hallowed turf and this is the way things are done. And it was just, these people are cool, they're easygoing, and they make wine, which is a great combination.
Do you think that actually translates through to the wine itself?
I think it does, to a degree, yes. I mean, obviously you were talking about rigidity in terms of rules of what you grow where and how you grow it. And I think Europe has in some ways benefited greatly from the fact that it has rules, but at the same time it's a bit of a straitjacket in other ways. And I think Australia's been able to express itself more easily for the lack of those, and the fact that it experiments very well, shares information, I think, very quickly, which allows it to progress a lot, but also allows it to conduct good experiments and make wine in a more exciting fashion sometimes. And I think it comes through in the wines to a degree. I think there's a lot more scope actually still for Australia to express itself in that way, not just in the wine, but the way it talks about its wine. I think a lot of what makes it very appealing to the rest of the world when it really first burst on the scene was exactly that openness and that boldness and that personality. I think there's an awful lot of really, really great humour within a lot of the Australian winemaking fraternity. And humour's not really a word or a concept that you see that much in a lot of the world's wine. I still look at a lot of the so-called banter that goes on between some critics, and I just think they just sound so stiff. And even when they debate humour, they manage to do it.
On Twitter, of all places.
Even on Twitter, and even when they debate humour and they defend their reasons for not being humorous, or they say, yes, I am, damn it, I'm funny. It just doesn't sound right. It's not really there. And I think in the real world, what I see when I go to things and meet winemakers and talk to people who drink wine in Australia, it's a fun environment.
That's true. I think that kind of the larrikin nature of Australians and certainly Australian winemakers was a key to their success.
I think you want to see that. I think people still want to not playing up to any kind of definition that the world might have of them, but actually to express their personality, I think, is what people do want to see.
Obviously, he's no longer with us, but we don't want winemakers going out and thinking they have to behave like Steve Irwin. But okay, just to play devil's advocate, what do you think about maybe the suggestion that because of the image that Australia essentially established for itself through its labeling and the style of wine it was producing and the kind of image of an Australian winemaker, wearing an Akuba and Blundstones and, cracking a tinny at the end of a long day kind of thing. Do you think that has served to dumb down Australian wine a little bit and to then get to a point where people are complaining that Australia is not considered as I hate to say it, a premium wine producing country? Like they kind of say, the rest of the world has no idea Australia makes these amazing wines, but then refusing to accept that that's the image that they essentially established themselves. And I'm talking like in the international market to a large extent.
Yeah, look, I think it's absolutely true that there is a need for Australia to remind the world that it makes very good, serious wine, as in seriously good wine. Especially, after that.
Like just from a regional perspective. Say each region makes different styles of wine.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And, I think there's quite a lot of acknowledgement in Australia at the moment that this is kind of like there needs to be a second coming, or perhaps there is a second coming already on international markets to project this image better, that it's not, just the fun, fruity sunshine in the glass wave. It's the wave of we're just as good as everyone else, if not better, on all these, all the points you expect in terms of, regional expression, in terms of quality, in terms of experience, in terms of matching variety to region, etc. I think, you have to project an image of seriousness in that regard. But at the same time, if everyone does that, then you're no different. And what Australia, I think, does have in its favour is it does have quite a lot more personality, I would say, than a lot of those regions, especially when you're, up against countries that have, these revered histories.
I guess it's one of the best things that we have going for us is that we can change.
Yep.
Whereas for them for a lot of these really, really established regions in Europe to suddenly change, it would seem really empty.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, what people want, I think, is a bit of excitement. When you're trying to persuade them to discover your wine, it's not just about how good it is, because there's an ocean of good wine out there. That's the point, I think. What you need to do is differentiate yourself probably on other things, such as, personality. What is it about your wine that's exciting? And Australian wine comes from an area, don't forget, that people want to come and see, because Australia still to overseas travellers is an absolute must-see place.
It's so funny.
It's so different. You forget how what it's like to go and look at something like the Clare Valley with a foreigner's eyes, because it's just another Australian wine region to a lot of people who have been, who live here. But, I remember the first time on the Riesling Trail, just casting my eye out in the morning light across the valley and just thinking, what a beautiful place. And I felt very, very far from home, and in a good way. It felt like a properly foreign place where people spoke differently and acted differently and welcomed you in a different way. And it's stunningly beautiful. And I think that you forget how desirable the name of Australia is to a foreign traveller. When I was at school, that's what everyone wanted to do when they finished. They wanted to backpack across to Australia, and there's a school exchange program, this sort of thing. I mean, people love this place.
So this is the thing that I couldn't, and I think it's probably a product of having grown up in Melbourne, and Melbourne to a certain extent not being like most of the rest of the country. I kind of never quite got the appeal of coming to Australia. It's like, I understood like Europe, oh my God, there's so much history and culture, and you go to the United States and it's just sort of so what fun, and they've got beautiful mountains and Grand Canyon, and South America is sort of wild and sexy, and Asia's got, such a different culture and so many people, so many things going on. I always thought, why would you want to come to Australia? It's a big empty country. Like, it's flat and it's dry and it's boring.
Exactly. But
it wasn't until I actually did a lot more traveling and then kind of after a while went, oh, this is really different to Australia. Now I understand why people want to go there, because it is so different.
Yeah.
Because like just the trees are different.
I always think first when I was back in, because my wife and I moved back to the UK for a while. We actually lived in Argentina for a year,
Wow.
and then back in London for about 5 years, and then moving back. The first time I drove out of the city again was to go up to Bilg in the Gambie, and there's just a moment when you're driving out for me where it just feels like the sky just opens up, and it's the biggest thing you've seen for 5 years when you've been living in London. It's just like, wow, I didn't realise that my vision could actually be opened up that much. You just see this vast space, a huge sky, and all those, lone gum trees in those fields just that seem to go on forever. And it feels completely foreign. But of course, when you're used to it, it's the same with everything. Something that's different really lights your mind. But you've got to look at the things from a different point of view, I think, when you work in a place, especially Australia. It's quite hard to keep track of the rest of the world in some regards because you are so far away. But I'm sure that when people from Australia go on their trips to Provine or to Vinitaly or whatever it may be, that they start to think about themselves from an outsider's viewpoint again, and must be reminded how exotic they are to other people. Because when you're here, you just feel the same. But as I was going back to my original point of going to Margaret River for the first time, that's cool. Those beaches are amazing. Talking as a POM, amazing views and the caves and that scenery around there, and then interspersed all around, beautiful wines with lovely wineries and kangaroos bounding around in the fields. That's
and Cellar Doors. To be honest, I think Cellar Doors were also a really important way to create sort of ambassadors for Australian wine back overseas, because as you say, a lot of people coming here for tourism, and so it's a fantastic thing to do. Whether you come to Melbourne, you might go out to the Yarra Valley or down to the Mornington Peninsula. You're in Adelaide, you go to McLaren Vale or the Adelaide Hills or the Barossa Valley. You go over to Perth, maybe if you're a bit more adventurous, you go further away down to Margaret River, which is a good 3 hours. And there's other stuff to do in those regions, which is fantastic. If you're a golf fan,
there's other
love
stuff,
to go down to
there's
Mornington.
other stuff to do. But talking about my original point about Europe, and travelling and thinking that this bottle kind of opens up if I were to go and picture it, or if I was to go to the place where this came from, I learn all about where the people are and how they grew up and what their ancestors did and the kind of world that they were born into and the climate and the history of the place. And of course, Australia's may have a short history. In some ways, talking about modern Australia, but in some ways that's an easy, accessible picture for people to take on board. Not like Europe where you're taking on layers and layers at once. But it's a really interesting short history too, I think. And you go to Margaret River or you go to Yarra Valley, if you live here, you take it for granted. But those places, they do seep their own history from every pore. In Margaret River, you have, the mapping of the zones and the grapes that they grow and why they grow them, the fact that they're right by the ocean, and that's what people do when they're in their downtime. Surfing and wine is cool if you're not from an area that has surf or wine. Like I am. So, they're more interesting, I think, than you realise just because you're familiar with them, I think.
And in terms of the more recent, I guess, freelance writing about wine, how did you sort of come into those kind of opportunities?
Well, I kind of made them, I guess, because I was in London prior to coming back here, working in news, and I was working in 24-hour news, which when I first started writing as a freelancer in sort of magazines and then into print media on newspapers. The idea that you would just have rolling news and headlines breaking in social media and multi-platform was, couldn't really imagine it. And actually, in a very short period of time, I think breaking news and 24-hour news really started to bore me quite a lot. I've always loved, journalism and discovering and stories. But I think by the time I finished in London after 5 years of 24-hour news, I'd had enough.
Well, it's funny you say that because actually a former guest of the show had pretty much the same experience in London.
Right.
Daniel Honan, the wine idealist who is up in Newcastle. He was working. He has a journalistic background, and he was working for I think a 24-hour news service, and kind of got a bit burnt out by it, and
took
solace
in a way it's
in wine.
I got into writing and into journalism and into languages and into travel, well, everything, because I enjoyed discovering and I enjoyed stories and I enjoyed depth. I guess that's one thing that I would say about all of my cultural pursuits. I like to discover layers to things, and if I'm reading something in a newspaper, I want to know, I want to know the background and I want to know everything if it's a good story.
Yeah.
And the one thing that's really happened to news more than anything else is this doing away with any deeper layers of meaning. When you're writing scripts for television, you just write snippets, 3 sentences, bang, and gone. And so that whole reason really for the whole thing that stokes your enthusiasm and gets you and sparks your curiosity is that idea of delving into a story, and you don't do it anymore in 24-hour news. Everything is taken over by something else, and there's so much triviality to it. It becomes really quite meaningless. And when I returned to Australia, I kind of thought that's enough of that. I'd rather get into something that does still have layers and depth and good stories around it, and had by this time really, and since coming to Australia for the first time, just got more and more interested in wine, and it's something that's I wanted to just learn more about. And so when you say how did the opportunity come up, I guess it didn't really. I just tried to make sure that there was some kind of opportunity, and I'm still working on whatever comes up just to work in wine because it's interesting.
How did you get involved? You joined the Wine Communicators of Australia?
Yeah, so I returned right at the back end of 2012. My wife and I came back, and I'd actually written for some newspapers that are published by the same people that do the Grape Grower and Winemaker magazine and the Wine and Viticulture Journal.
Yep.
Hence my trip to Bilk in, I think it was November 2012, because they are the hosts of the Great Australian Shiraz Challenge.
Yeah.
So that was my first commission in this new venture. So pretty recent, really. But
so you were writing about it?
I had to go up and interview the winner, which in 2012 was Leconfield Wines for their Richard Hamilton Shiraz, which won, I think it was a $20 bottle of Shiraz that won the under $25 bottle and the Great Australian Shiraz Challenge outright from its 2010 vintage. So I interviewed Paul Gordon from Leconfield at the dinner, and yeah, I was that was my first job, I guess, of what's a fledgling but continuing career, I hope, in wine.
But you've had the opportunity to sort of, I guess, meet with and write about wines and wineries from the smallest to the largest. And certainly I think you went across to Adelaide for Savour, which I believe I mentioned in a previous episode. That was this big thing organised by Wine Australia. A lot of international guests were invited down, and it was this huge sort of symposium about
That's right.
Australian
It was
wine.
in September last year. And so talking about that earlier, I mentioned the second coming. I guess that this is part of that kick-starting, trying to re-energise the Australian wine industry and put it back, show the world that it's back, and it's serious and it's better than ever. So yeah, I was lucky enough to go to that and really enjoyed it, got a lot out of it, and thought it was a very good forum, really. And I think for a lot of people, just the beginning of this new assault, I guess, on export markets for Australia. But that was, really interesting to see how Australia sees itself as a wine industry, and it's had some terrible years, terrible challenges over the last sort of 5 or so years. And I've just completed for the Grape Grown Winemaker magazine a feature on the top 20 wine companies of Australia, which kind of gives quite an interesting snapshot, because this year compared to last year, most of these guys are moderately more optimistic about their place in the world in terms of export markets. I mean, part of that, the dollar, although it's sort of seems to be heading up again, has helped them a little bit by weakening a touch. But it's quite interesting just to see the picture as viewed by big producers, and right at the other end of the scale, I suppose, where I am on the Mornington Peninsula, and I guess a lot of the stories that I've covered for other things has been at the much smaller end of the scale. Mm-hmm. So as an industry, I think it's faced some really tricky questions, and it still does, but it is still producing some fantastic product, and it has a very good story to tell. There's great diversity here, great personalities behind the wines, and I think the opportunity is huge, but so is the challenge for them. But it's an interesting thing to write about always. Like I said, the thing that drew me to it in the first place was the names, the places, the people, and the stories, and that's why I'm still here.
Sure, you've written some articles for The Guardian, so obviously UK based, and I think you actually wrote about a former guest of the show, Tom Carson, and the momentous win of the Jimmy Watson Trophy.
That's right, yeah. So, Tom was very interesting to talk about. And I guess last year was, I don't know, people were talking about it as being Pinot's year, and then it's going to be Pinot's decade. I'm not sure if it's going to last for 10 years. But there's no doubt about it, is there, that Pinot Noir is kicking some pretty big goals at the moment in terms of international and domestic recognition. Mm-hmm. One of my favourite drops, yours?
Yeah, of course. Pinot was that was my prolific wine moment. Was actually 1997 Yeringberg Pinot Noir. Enjoyed my sister's 21st birthday dinner at Izard, and I think that was the one that I tasted, and I just got it. I think I'd already liked Pinot Noir, and so that's why I was excited to order it. It had a little bit of age on it, which was always sort of, wow, cool. I think I don't drink as much Pinot Noir as I probably did in the past. I think now I tend to gravitate more towards Italian wine or Italian varieties, certainly. But I'll always come back to Pinot Noir and Chardonnay. They were the two that got me.
Yeah, living down on the Mornington Peninsula, it becomes something of a default. So I'm going not going the other way. It's been fantastic actually to get to know more Pinot Noir than I did before. Certainly when I first came to Australia, talking about those times of discovering wines, 12 years ago, Pinot Noir was out of my price range then. It still is, but I guess I'm able to pick up some dog ends here and there, apart from anything else.
Yeah, but the quality of Pinot is under $20.
Yeah, absolutely.
Has actually improved quite a lot. I think that's been
it's still
a really big effect on Pinot in Australia.
Yeah, and that's a continuing trend. I think there are more popping up.
Has to be
here and there.
I think I was saying to you off air that there are a number of varieties, certainly in Australia, where you can actually get some really, really surprising quality. I think Pinot Noir probably in the past hasn't been one of them, but hopefully that continues to change.
Yeah, I think it's also because we were talking about this with regard to Chardonnay, because I work in a cellar door, which is a specialist in Pinot Noir and Chardonnay. And so I face an awful lot of questions about Chardonnay. Among other things, we managed to talk about all varieties and all regions, because people who come in, they love to share their stories about what they like to drink and what their kind of comfort drops are, I guess. And Chardonnay, you always find it has probably the greatest probably the greatest level of misunderstanding, I think, in some ways. A lot of people have been put off and scarred, and I realise that that it's quite easy to make generalisations about things that you don't drink very often.
Sure.
Hence my my sort of week's project is to have a look at some Chardonnays from further down the price range and just check in, because you just find yourself, if you're not careful, spouting or perpetuating the same myths. If you're not careful, if you don't look at these things and see actually if your memory of them is the same or whether they have actually changed since you last had a good look. Mm-hmm. So the worst thing would be for me, who someone who's very interested in people's perceptions of wine and their journeys. The worst thing I think I could be is lazy myself in not looking for new things and not making sure that I have tasted the things I'm talking about.
I think there are a lot of people involved with wine, whether journalists or people working in trade or winemakers themselves, who I think forget what most people are drinking, and most people are drinking under $15.
Yeah,
and essentially that's sort of you can't forget that. I guess that segment, because otherwise you're just going to continue to lose people, because a lot of people, that's their starting point.
Yeah, we
want them to graduate to higher quality and ideally higher priced wines, but if we forget, if we neglect that segment, then we'll never get them onto wine in the first place.
Yeah. I think prices aside, one thing that was one of the guys that I spoke to as part of this top 20 feature for the Great Ground Winemaker magazine said that his biggest wish is just that people think about wine, and I think that that's really all there is to it. I think in any industry that you work, be it in publishing or in movie production or anything,
or luxury fashion,
you do want people to choose based on thought and consideration rather than just on price, because
and also what they like.
Yeah, because the minute that whenever you work in something where everything is driven by price, obviously all incentivizing comes back to that too, and then over time most products will be geared towards that.
Yeah,
and I think with wine the most important thing, or with any of those things really, is that you do want people to come at it with an open mind. If they do and they choose to drink, they drink what they like, that's great.
Yeah.
But, it doesn't really feed, I don't think, a very interesting society when you have people making choices on anything, be it wine, as I say, be it books, be it, the movies I choose to go and see in the cinema. It only gets dumbed down if people don't have, I guess, an incentive or a means to open their minds and choose differently or think more deeply about what they do. And anyone who's passionate about wine just wants to see it be an active, dynamic, interesting sector where you really can drive decent new products into the market potentially, but also just continue to make the best you can and have it and find a market for it. Because otherwise it does get dull.
Very dull. Well, I think it's been a really fascinating chat. Thank you for joining me today, Ed. What's the best way people can get in touch with you? You're on Twitter?
I am on Twitter at Van Merrison. That's VinMerrison. Or I'd love to have more people have a look at my blog, which is bonnezeauxgonzo.com. Apologies for
you might have to
that's
spell
quite
that.
Difficult to spell. BONNEZEAUXGONZO. Bonnezeaux Gonzo. So it rhymes, but it's just a stupid thing to call your blog if you want people to find it. But have a look.
Great. Gonzo, obviously in reference to Hunter S. Thompson.
Yeah, and Bonnezeaux in reference to sweet wine from the Loire.
Oh, I thought it was... Oh, no, wait. I was thinking of Gonzo. Well, thank you again, Ed, and I look forward to catching up with you somewhere out there to taste.
Brilliant, James. Well, thanks for having me on. I've enjoyed it.
Thanks again for listening, guys. As I mentioned at the beginning, please do hit me up on the blog intrepidwino.com where I have all the episodes. But do subscribe on iTunes or Stitcher, and please leave me a rating, a review, comments, interaction of some sort. Hit me up on Twitter at intrepidwino, or the podcast is at the Vincast. But until next time, bye.